because I ate a lot of candy.
I think she.
Who's sitting here?
How's everything? How's everything good?
There's like no space happening waiting for the
School is good.
Let's see until Julia notices that I changed his chair.
A little bit jumping around. No, you really got it. Just because this is my last one.
You're still sitting here.
Oh, I got it.
I just don't want to cover the camera. No. You see? Yeah, I know.
I can dance.
Maybe you can read your paper. Heavy metal kind of rematched.
Do it all better.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dexter Hopkins, and I'll be the chair of this second panel on Johns Hopkins University. Fortunately, Mary and Kelly will not be joining us today. Two of the excellent grad students from Johns Hopkins University. So welcome to the second panel on urban construction of national identity. Without further ado, I'll introduce Christian Hart, graduate student at JHU, as I mentioned. He's a third-year doctoral student in the Spanish department at JHU. He's doing his BA in Spanish and BA in Electronic Media and Film from Towson University. And his research focuses on heavy metal music in El Salvador as a philosophy of life. How this philosophy allows the metalhead to experience reality, society, culture, politics, etc. through a separate and distinct frame than that of the local popular culture. So he's going to be presenting on the Salvadoran heavy metal and the questioning of national identity. So,
All right. So I guess to first sort of explain El Salvador to everybody. I mean, El Salvador is in Central America, and there's a very, I believe, very specific way that El Salvador is represented not only in the national sense, but in the international world, what is exported from El Salvador, the idea of what a Salvadoran is. Basically, the characteristics that come to define the average Salvadoran, and most of it has to do with rural spaces, mainly because the average immigrant that leaves El Salvador is from a rural context. So what we see in the international world is, national food, the pupusa, the national music, tropicales, and we have, one of my examples here is A mí me gustan las pupusas, which is a very famous Salvadoran song that's known worldwide. I like pupusas, right? If you want to. And this is basically just to give a context to the idea of generally how El Salvador is seen. I believe so. There's a sound on the top left. Near the escape button. There. Yeah, right there.
I'm gonna turn off the light also.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
How do you bring this out?
One is enough? Yeah.
Alright, the sound is playing, but it's not playing. But it's not. It's not playing.
Seems just great, yeah.
Yeah, I can do
Had
this.
this on both.
Turn it up on. Yeah, she cut off the speakers. It's kind of weird. Just say it again. Literally. Sounds, that's another thing. It's freaking out. Yeah, yeah. Get the buzz. Yeah, play everything.
Over again.
Yo soy banano y voy a invitarlos para que vengan a saborear conmigo esa comida que en El Salvador siempre acostumbro y me gusta comer. Son pasteles, no, no son pasteles, son tamales, no, no son tamales, son garrobos, no, no son garrobos, yuca frita, no, no, no. Queso que te gusta, queso que te gusta, queso que te gusta, queso que te gusta. A mí me gustan las pupusas.
Alright, so this is generally the idea when I, in the past, had asked somebody, what do you think about Salvador, or how do you define Salvador? And this is more or less the idea that is presented to me. Very rural living, a lot of agriculture, very typical food, music, dress, and it's also what is often exported from El Salvador in the Salvadoran media. For example, the next video I had, which I won't play the audio for, but we can play a minute of it, is a comedian from El Salvador called Las Tenchis. And it's a man who dresses as a woman in traditional Salvadoran female rural dress. And she's always pregnant. Every time you see Las Tenchis, she's pregnant. And she dances with the big belly. And it's a laugh, but what it is it's the idea of a Salvadoran, right? The characteristics that are more or less agreed upon. She's loud, she's obnoxious, she's rude, etc., etc. More of the negative connotations. But this is sort of summed up in the idea of the guanaco, right? Salvadorans refer to themselves oftentimes as a guanaco, which is it's a family member of the llama. And the way it was explained to me is it's an animal where you gotta poke really hard to do anything, right? It's bullheaded, it's obnoxious. It'll work hard if you can poke it hard enough, right? But then there's also the positive aspects, which I went back to a book called La Población del Salvador, The Population of El Salvador, written in 1940 by Baron Castro. And Baron Castro basically goes from pre-conquest El Salvador to present-day El Salvador and tries to describe how the population grew, what the population is like now, what are the characteristics of the average person, right? So what he breaks it down to is basically that Salvador did not experience the same waves of immigration as the rest of Latin America, Argentina, et cetera, et cetera. So what we have is a very mixed culture, a mestizaje, right? Between Indian, mestizo, and blanco, which he says makes up the entirety of the Salvadoran population. He links this to the idea of gobernar es poblar, to govern is to populate. In his sense, population is homogenization of the different races into one. And then he goes in to explain how the Salvadoran identity is formed. Talks about the mass destruction of the capital over 5 or 6 different earthquakes in the 17 and 1800s, and how the Salvadoran, even when everything is broken down, they just stay and they continue to rebuild, and they continue to rebuild. They're resilient, right? Resilient and hardworking. And then he talks about how the population grew due to high birth rates, low mortality rates, extraordinary vital strength, right? But at the end of his book, his conclusion, I feel, is the most important, where he basically sets the framework for what would later be taken and formalized into the Salvadoran identity. He says, a numerous people, hardworking and resolute, that unravels and progresses in a narrow territory, labors its lands with skillful mastery, plants cities where the telluric forces destroy them, fills its soil with large and small industries, with roads, with vehicles, etc. And then he goes in to talk about the rural towns, the sound of the village bell, all these things. And then he concludes saying, you would see a people whom you would have to consider united by a double bond of blood and spirit. The first reflected in the color of their skin, and the second in their speech, in their culture, and in their religion. You would see the essence of the Spanish, the indigenous, and the mestizo, which is nothing more than the essence of the Salvadoran. There is not then in the town any rupture from which to escape, with reason, a dissenting voice. And that's exactly what I believe the heavy metal scene is attempting to do. The heavy metal scene is the dissenting voice that Baron Castro says does not exist, right? Could not possibly exist in El Salvador. We're perfectly, acculturated. We've all gone through mestizaje. We're one people, we're all Salvadoran, right? And this idea is spread over the next few generations of writers, Francisco Gavidia, Mas Ferrer, and it keeps going and going. Salarulle is another writer who basically solidifies this rural image of the Salvadoran. And then what I wanted to get into first was basically how heavy metal itself, outside of El Salvador, does the same thing. It takes a type of identity and tries to rework it and tries to show you, you're seeing things the wrong way. There's more to this than just what's being put in the media. One of the bands that I wanted to show was Rage Against the Machine, who was very good. First of all, they're very linked to Latin America. Most of their music was about Latin American issues, but they also took the United States into consideration, both politically, socially, tried to deconstruct the United States identity. And I will show the video now and just play it in the background while we speak. But in the same thing, we'll see that there's a large questioning about urban spaces. Almost everything here happens in urban spaces. And in this specific video, it's mainly about politicians during the Al Gore and Bush election. Very anti-capitalism. In fact, Rage Against the Machine made the Che Guevara t-shirt popular once again in the 90s, at least in the United States. So if we see, there's a lot of talk about urban mass populations trying to fight for something, fight for either an identity, fight for political power, fight for social precedence or whatever they need, basically to raise themselves up from a lower level. So Rage Against the Machine was one of the first bands that I believe brought attention to Latin America, at least through the metal scene, through music in the United States. And then another band would be Sepultura. From the other side of the world, from Brazil, Sepultura is actually one of the first metal bands to leave Latin America and make it popular, make Latin American metal popular elsewhere. But we see the same idea. There's lots of bodies, urban demonstrations, what I would describe as urban wastelands. Right, so war, fighting, being patted down, et cetera, et cetera. In El Salvador, we have basically the same idea. We'll take a quick look at, once it loads. Give it a little. There you go. The same thing, we have an urban highway in the distance and behind us, urban destruction. Whose band name is, of course, after the wife of Edgar Allan Poe. This is Heresies, another band from Capital. Again, they're in a broken down urban warehouse. Everything's falling apart, right? So the contrast is almost palpable, I mean, between A mí me gustan las pupusas and Heresies and Virginia Clements, a complete different structuring of what we are. And it's not just a Europeanization of we're going to be more like the United States, we're going to be more like Europe. It's claiming it as their own. We are Salvadoran metal bands, right? We're not just metal bands, we are Salvadoran metal bands. Every year they have a Salvadoran Metal Fest, which this year was the 20th anniversary, which I actually just got back from on Tuesday. And it's all national bands. Nobody else is allowed to play, right? 14, I believe it was 14 or 15 national bands from 5 in the afternoon to 3 in the morning, non-stop, no break between bands. right? About 30 minutes, 45 minutes each, but national bands. We are Salvadoran and we are heavy metal, right? And we want to focus on, you know, what it is to be Salvadoran, and many of the songs, they attack other issues as well, social, politics, et cetera, et cetera. But there's sort of a redefining of ourselves, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that the urban landscape of San Salvador is often very overlooked. And this is the landscape in which most of these bands live. They're not from out in the rural areas, they're from the big cities, from San Miguel, Santa Ana, San Salvador, right? This is where the scene is at, and this is what you know, they want to sort of break out of that shell. But it's not just images, and it's not just making noise and calling attention. Another thing is the lyrical content, which is where I start to get into the philosophical aspect, right? It's an act of writing, it's an act of intellectual work goes into it. It's not just, let's play fast and play loud and irritate people, but let's get their attention while we have a message to speak. So one of the first bands that tries to do this is called La Iguana, which is like the iguana, right? And they have a song called Yes Patron. I don't know if it'll show the lyrics. But this is one of the very first metal bands, early 80s. And what they do with this song is they take the Our Father prayer, Nuestro Padre que está en el cielo, and they change the words around, directing themselves to North America, to the United States, right? It doesn't show the words, but they take the Our Father prayer and they say, Our patron who is in the north, capitalized be your name, deport us from your kingdom. Your will be done in El Salvador as it is in Latin America. Import to us our daily bread and exploit us as we exploit our workers. Do not let us fall into revolution. Better yet, free us from marks. Because yours is the kingdom, the power for the ages, and the ages okay. Right. So, as you can see, with the lyrical content, we're speaking of a re-rendering of a political issue. It's not just, oh, let's play loud, let's play hard, let's play fast, right? They're trying to say something that's important, not only to them, but also to the rest of Latin America. And another way that this is done in Salvadoran metal is a recalling of the native past of the Pipil, which they spoke the Nahuatl language, right? So this last band that I was showing, before everyone gets tired of metal, is Araña, and they have the song Teoto. So here we have the common death paint, which is also common to a lot of metal. But the song itself repeats themes that were done by Sepultura. Sepultura song Refuse, Resist, right? And this in the name of the Nahuatl god Teoto. They say what we should do is resist, wait, destroy, right? So the same repetition of resistance, not just to the government, but resistance to local popular culture. In the local metal scene, there's a lot of disdain for over-exaggerated local identities, such as local soccer games. If you like soccer, you're not a metalero, right? You're not a metalhead if you watch soccer, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a community that's trying to redefine itself in a national landscape as well, not just as musicians. The other problem that a lot of these metal bands has is the fact that they have to confront the idea that they're seen as violent. metal is very violent music, et cetera, and because of this and the tattoo culture, et cetera, they are often linked with the gangs in El Salvador, which is the other exported image we have. You know, La Mara Salvatrucha, the extreme gang violence that's going on. And the metalhead often gets thrown into this group, especially in an international sense. You see big tattooed guy with long hair, it's probably a gang member, whereas he might be a metalhead. So there's also this trying to distance themselves from this idea of violence while playing aggressive, violent music. So sort of a catch-22 on that end. Other than that, I mean, to me, from what I've seen, these are generally middle-class people that are working. Most of them own bars. They have jobs during the day. They have to change their image between playing with their band and going to work. Between going to work, that like the drummer for Heresies owns a bar where bands can come and practice, but he also works at the Supreme Court. So in the morning, he has to go to the Supreme Court. He's got to work all day. Then he's got to get off work, go to his bar, make sure everything's running, let his hair down, be a metalhead, and repeat. Rinse, wash, repeat. Right? But this is basically the scene that's going on, and I've linked, at least in this specific paper, I've linked it to the idea of national identity, because this is a lot of conversations that we've had around the table when talking to metalheads. Like, how are we seen? How do you see us in the United States? And then you explain, you know, a mí me gustan las pupusas. No, that's not us. So, I guess that's my presentation.
Thank you very much. Next up, I invite Gustavo Valdivia. His presentation on neoliberal cities also died, the tensions of the indigenous presence in urban Lima. So Gustavo has a master's in climate science from Columbia University and is a third-year student in the Department of Anthropology at JHU. Since 2008, he's been doing field work in the highest altitude communities in the Peruvian Andes. In his dissertation, he plans to investigate the representation of Andes mountains in climate science and to explore ethnographically the local understandings of climate and climate change in the Andean community. In the summer of 2014, he started a collaborative project with Thomas Tull, a Peruvian experimental musician, to produce ethnographic sound recordings of the melting ice of Calcaya, the largest tropical glacier in the world, the community of Panay in Peru. So,
I'm gonna start with my paper, and just gonna start showing up with the background, so someone can help with that video. So, in psychoanalysis, catexis is defined as the process of investment of mental or emotional energy in a person, object, or idea. Freud often described a libido as the producer of energies that, if locked, require release in other ways. If an individual is frustrated in his or her desires, Freud often represented that frustration as a blockage of energies that will be then built up and require release in other ways. For example, by way of regression and the recatexing of former positions. This paper can be read as a direct consequence of my own intellectual catexis, not wanting to go where I wish to direct it, becoming an anthropologist, or more precisely, an ambient anthropologist. But my presentation is not merely about the disorienting moving of my desires and abstract intellectual topic. Thanks to Tristan Priggs, we know that even Davis Ross sometimes wonder if his attraction to anthropology, however unwittingly, was not finally oriented, quote, by structural affinity between the civilizations which are anthropology's subject and Lévi-Strauss' own thought processes, unquote. In my case, more modestly, of course, I hope to show something about this movement on a tangible level, as an embodied, desiring creature, rather than merely as a disembodied, judging mind. The story ends well, fortunately. Through this exercise, I managed to mobilize a complex play of identifications and disidentifications that have finally allowed me to arrive to a newly energized relationship to my desire. So going back to conference and Latin American cities. In this conference paper, which is at a very early stage, I explore the possibilities of contemporary art to engage ethnographically with the complex ways in and the power relations through which indigenous activities are being produced and sustained in urban Lima. Also, I believe that it is extremely necessary to foster a critique of the protocols of research that orient Peruvian anthropology. Here I am more interested in exploring the implications and analytical limitations of anthropological practices of representation of the Andean world based on a reductionist and somehow economicistic approach, which has become predominant since the 80s in Peruvian anthropology, or more precisely among anthropologists living in Peru. Second, I approach this question through engaging with the recent video art project by the Peruvian artist Jose Vera. Richard Haxa, Museums Also Die. Here, I approach Vera's work as a form of knowledge and not aesthetics, and take seriously the practices how it was produced, its process of representing core realities, and its possibilities to overcome the limitations of anthropological academic texts. As we know, the tension between the desire to embody the experience of others and the desire to maintain some sort of scientific rigor are yet unresolved in anthropology. Within this framework, I consider the questions Vera's work addresses are not problems to be solved, but rather areas to be inhabited. You want to? Then, see if you can expand the video for. Yeah. Okay. And then put full screen. In the last decades, Peruvian anthropologists have mostly abandoned their early ethnographic interests in rural Andean communities. The situation was different, however, when Peruvian anthropology emerged as an academic discipline in 1946 as the offspring of indigenism. It was precisely in 1946, with the publication of the Handbook of South American Indians, edited by Julian Stewart, when the Andean highlands were articulated as a cultural area. The publication of this influential book crystallized the definition of the Andes as one of the 4 cultural areas of South America and gave birth to the notion of the Andean. After the handbook, the idea of an Andean exceptionalism was also rapidly incorporated by Peruvian anthropologists, were strongly influenced by North American cultural ecology. In this context, most of the Andean literature also assumed the idea that the highland peoples had a common cultural basis that could be visualized in the stable adaptation to their complex environment developed since pre-Hispanic times. Just a year before the publication of the handbook in 1945, Luis Y. Valcárcel, probably the most influential Peruvian indigenista and the first director of the Museo de la Cultura Peruana, anticipated in a very apocalyptic tone the death of the old Lima. I quote, "The falling apart of the old Lima is a symbol of the destruction of the past without glory, of a landscape without grandeur, of a traditional, dark, and just and disgraceful life." The ritualesca, that means it's a term that refers to the colonial celebration of the more superficial high society in Peru. Tradition dies for the emergence of the Lima of the future. The intellectual landscape that gave birth to anthropology started changing in the midst of the great transformation of the Peruvian society during the 60s. The land reform, market expansion, urbanization, and immigration. During that time, the 60s, the oligarch regime, which divided the Peruvian Andean societies in whites, mestizos, and Indians, was, as some authors argued, basically dismantled. In this context, again, Peruvian anthropologists are moving away from the framework of indigenismo, and new questions and preoccupations about the redefinition of indigenous ethnicity and subjectivity were formulated. But it was only in the 80s, as Yuri Gosser suggests, under the global dominance of neoliberalism, the emergence of the shining past insurgency, and the fall of the real socialists, when Andean peasants ceased to be politically important actor in Peru. During that time, Peruvian anthropology generally agreed that Peru was a, quote, fragmented country but in frank process of modernization, and therefore they considered that the future was in the cities and the industrial sector. Also an important group of scholars for whom in Peru, and especially in the Andes, more, quote, opening doors and windows to modernity it was important to criticize it, I'm quoting Flores Galindo. A second, more influential group took another turn. They adopted a more optimistic vision about the democratic possibilities that immigration from the countryside to cities and the new status as migrant actors could contain for indigenous populations from the Andes. Two major anthropologists are the most representative of this trend, Carlos Iván de Gregory and Jürgen Wolte, both affiliated with the Institute of Peruvian Studies, an intellectual think tank located in Lima. In this new intellectual context, the massive peasant immigration started to be considered central to redefine the terms of ethnic identities. As de Gregory argued, since the 80s, the locus par excellence of the Andean was no longer centered in the countryside or the Andes, but in Lima and other big cities, end of quote. Consequently, peasant immigrants were seen as the most important political actor in the Peruvian society, a critical mass to formulate a set of cultural events in the countryside and cities. This way, the Andean space was not anymore defined by the environmental setting of the mountains. As Ramón Pajuelo has suggested, with peasant immigration to the cities, Andean culture became separated from its territorial context. Rather, contemporary Andean culture became the space between different points of a single circuit that was integrated by family ties, village loyalties, and constant circulation of goods, ideas, and people. Similarly, for Jürgen Wolte, the current territorial dynamics in the Andes, especially in the context of the massive migration from the rural areas to large cities in the last decades, which have also inspired the first Peruvian urban anthropological studies, have determined that the contemporary Andean culture is not linked to a territory anymore, and relies instead on, quote, urban-rural networks. But what was the cost of these transformations? De Gregory minimized the consequences they had in the constitution of indigenous migrant subjects, and preferred instead to highlight the transformation potential of cultural integration. As he argued, quote, undoubtedly school, migration, and modernization in general have had brutal ethnocidal effects, especially in the new urban world. Language and traditional customs, the two main external signs by which the Indians prove easily recognizable and also despised. That seems to be the cost of modernization, end of quote. In words of someone close to this approach, also Carlos Franco, the transformation of the cultural identity was the price that culturally diverse masses had to pay to occupy the cities. As we can see, the concrete consequence of this move were that the ethnic and colonial background of the Peruvian society was invisibilized, to the point that studies on Andean communities virtually disappeared. Instead, maintaining mainstream assumptions of kinship theory, attention moved from the countryside to the city, and to the cases of peasant immigrants who were able to successfully articulate to the market urban and political life and to formal education. Furthermore, studies on our urban subjects in Lima, or more precisely on their consumption habits, religiosity, entertainment preferences, commercial networks, or entrepreneurship skills of an idealized entrepreneurial subject, became the central focus of Peruvian anthropology. The second part of this paper is called Anthropology as Art and Art as Anthropology. In 1931, Cesar Vallejo, the most important Peruvian poet, wrote Telluric and Magnetic, a central poem in his work and one of the few he dedicated to the Peruvian highlands. In this piece, one of a series of poems written while he was living in Paris, Vallejo imbricates powerful images of the environment and real life in the Peruvian Andes to question the division between manual and intellectual work. In the poem, what becomes clear is that Vallejo's use of localized images of the Andes aimed to destabilize the dominant geographical, humanistic, and political ideas of his time, 1931, and their reductionist and in some cases idealized representation of the Peruvian highlands. The first lines of the poem starts with these lines: all human fields, solar and nutritious substance of the sea, an oceanic feeling for everything, all climates found within gold, ready, all intellectual field of cordilleras, with religion, with fields, with ducklings, pachyderms in prose when passing, and in poetry when stopping. In Vallejo's view, the solar and nutritious highlands, while being irregular and telluric, represent a serious analytical challenge for the prevailing discussions of the time, at least when contrasted with other environments as the horizontal and fluid ocean level lands. For Vallejo, however, despite their exceptionality, the Andes were not an inaccessible object of human knowledge. In contrast, Vallejo's incessant use of locally circumscribed Andean images evoked his commitment with positioning Peru's intellectual field of Cordilleras with the most important scientific, political, and sociological debates of his time. In this sense, the uniqueness of the Andean world was not only a nationalistic problem, but one of great and global human importance. The poem in his lines: slows caught in the act, tearful alchemia of my own souls, Sierra of my Peru, Peru of the world, and Peru at the foot of the globe I adhere. Vallejo's early intuitions about the exceptional implication of human life in the primeval complexity of the Andean environment suggest the idea of the Andes as a region that goes beyond a specific place and time, or more precisely, beyond Vallejo's intellectual and political milieu. In this sense, if my non-orthodox reading of Telluric Magnetic is correct, the situation identified by Vallejo in his poem resonates vividly with the tensions that have historically emerged from the juxtaposition and mismatch of a set of imaginary layers that, although in an unstable way, have configured the Peruvian Andean space. Similarly, in 1928, José Carlos Mariátegui, a Peruvian famous Marxist, was aware of the tensions that the Peruvian highlands presented for the central political administration power in Lima. In Mariátegui's reading, using a tone that resonates with some recent debates, I'm thinking about Scott, the Andes were a sort of area of refuge, where the Indians, in their efforts to resist, were able to fearfully take refuge. The Sierra, also controlled politically since colonial time from Lima, had never been spiritually absorbed by it, as he said. More recently, in 2003, Antonio Cornejo Polar, a literary critic, suggested an alternative reading of the images of the indigenous world and language used to produce them outside the indigenous world. But I think can be extended today for those who negate the relevance of indigenous objectivities for understanding the social world in urban Peru. For Cornejo Polar, instead of paying attention to the quote, incongruities, ambiguities, and aporias of these images, it is more illuminating to discuss about how they reflect and reproduce instead the contradiction of a society.
So is this for you?
No, it's Can you again? Can you? If you click back?
Next one.
Yeah, probably.
But I just,
Oh, also yes. Fair enough.
Close it now?
yeah, just close it.
Yeah. Oh, sorry for that. For Cornejo Polar, instead of paying attention to the incongruities, ambiguities, and aporias of these images, it is more illuminating to discuss about how they reflect and reproduce. Instead, quote, the contradiction of a society that can neither understand itself nor reproduce convincing images of its own problems, except when it reproduces them discursively, end of quote. In some sense, the Peruvian artist Jose Vera's recent work resonates with Cornejo's Polar approach. Richard Hack's Museums Also Died is a direct allusion to the Polish architect Richard Malachowski, as well as the short film by Chris Marker and Alan Bresna, Statues Also Died, from 1953. Malachowski developed a prolific career in Peru after raising many of the most important buildings in the city of Lima at the beginning of the 20th century, most of them marked with a neo-colonial style. In this piece, however, Vera focuses on the video you just showed, where Vera focuses on a special project that Malachowski designed in 1934, a Museum of Peruvian Culture, Museo de la Cultura Peruana, a building with neo-Inca architectural style that was highly influenced by the Indigenista movement. The building contains formal reminiscence of certain vestiges of Andean native cultures, for example, Tiahuanaco, and is considered, quote, the only Indigenista building in Lima. Its design, however, mostly represents Malachowski's own eclectic interpretation of the pre-Columbian world. According to Malachowski's vision, elaborate semi-reproductions of Inca masonry, pre-Inca tenon heads, and anthropomorphic monolith, combined with other pre-Columbian elements of totems that surround the building in order to create a thick aesthetic that characterizes the entire eclectic structure. For this reason, Henri Fabre considered that the Museum of Peruvian Culture was, quote, the worst example of what this architecture, indigenista, was capable of, end quote. Berra's video captured this eclecticism and the contradiction it engenders very well, and situates them in a larger global problematic. More precisely, Berra's video brilliantly resituates the Peruvian indigenista movement in the context of the current neoliberal celebration of the Peruvian economic boom. What starts off as a fairly romantic and subdued portrait of images of the pre-colonial world in his video ends up a mute, discontextualized exhibition of various indigenous objects devoid of use, cultural significance, or aesthetics. The museum is revealed then as a tragicomic replica of a pre-Hispanic temple, a stereotypical scenario of an ancient civilization perfectly tailored for the contemporary viewer. The anthropologist Paul Stoller has suggested that, as opposed to artists, academics are, quote, 50 years behind the time. In Berra's work, what seems to be a radical but nowadays conventional critique of indigenismo is made more complicated when considered within the frame of Markers and Resnais' famous film essay, to which the piece makes a direct reference. Claude Lévi-Strauss has brilliantly shown that all art objects, especially those which belong to the sphere of the so-called primitive art, are in fact mediators through which we establish a relation to the natural world as well as to other human beings. As he wrote, quote, our lies halfway between scientific knowledge and mythical minds at all, end of quote. From this approach, art objects cannot be reduced to static pieces for aesthetic contemplation. In a similar vein, Statues Also Die offers a critique to the colonial appropriation of primitive art objects. Along the film, it is shown how the institutional mechanism of African ethnographic museums, by placing art objects outside everyday life, they are transforming and therefore symbolically killing them. In his video, Berra recovers and follows to extreme the famous words with which the film opens. Quote, when men die, they enter history. When statues die, they enter art. Berra's video serves as a reflexive exercise of excavation, which in little more than 10 minutes appears to present a crucial archaeological discovery. In a style reminiscent of Jean Renoir, the camera begins with close-up shots of the museum's architectural details. Gradually, the camera opens out to expose details of what appears to be a lost pre-Columbian construction in some inhospitable place, eventually revealing the location and status of this complex and placing it within its real context. It is only then when what was initially presented as a construction of a pre-Columbian civilization, loaded with rich esoteric symbolic values to decipher and laden with majesty and transcendent meaning, is silently revealed as a bizarre replica, as a real-scale souvenir in an urban context. Furthermore, the building is finally shown as it is today, vandalized, abandoned, and immersed in a hostile landscape that has devoured it. Its Inca walls are exposed to contact with and the constant movement of the realities of Lima's neoliberal present, which has transformed this replica into a real ruined temple, into a dead museum that, as Balcázar anticipated, though perhaps unintentionally, has finally entered art. This is the last part of my paper called Art as Form of Knowledge. What I wanted to suggest with this paper is that the end of the 1980s, at the end of the 1980s, an open historical cycle closes in the mid-20th century, when anthropology of indigenous inspiration tried to build a new intellectual representation of indigenous peoples, in which Andean peoples were real protagonists of history. We all know now, as many authors have shown, that indigenism in practice ended having a very paternalistic, exotizing, and homogenizing approach to the role played by mestizos or Indians in the Peruvian nation building process. However, is that everything we need to know to understand the utopias, biographies, and intellectual practices of one of the most persistent efforts made in the 20th century by instituting an anthropology that tried to return the Andes and Andean people to a prominent position in the colonial and Republican historical consciousness? Furthermore, Berra's video confronts us with some questions that mainstream Peruvian anthropology has left aside in the last decades. Is it possible to produce an image of the Andean world that, without tergiversating and homogenizing it, is still legible for a distant public, started by anthropologists themselves or ourselves? What is the accepted range of difference within Andean indigenous subjectivities that can be translated into academic text, and the tensions and conflicts that emerge through this process? Furthermore, how to address issues related to the formation, recreation, and amalgamations of these subjectivities and ways of living in urban contexts, while situating them inside the realities produced by historical power relations and, more recently, neoliberal socio-economic marginalization. In 1927, Mariátegui was already aware that to represent the Andean world was to act from a place of impossibility. In reference to the indigenistic literature, he wrote, quote, "Indigenistic literature cannot give us a strictly authentic version of the Indian, for it must idealize and stylize him, nor can it give us his soul. It is still a mestizo literature, and as such is called indigenistic, rather than indigenous. If an indigenous literature finally appears, it will be when the Indians themselves are able to produce it." End of quote. Mariátegui understood this, and to my delight, Vera also does. In fact, the compelling power of Richard Hudson's museums also die stems from the fact that, as Theodore Adorno insisted a few decades ago, he answers to questions brought before it from outside. Contrary to De Gregori and Golte, who weren't able to imagine collective solutions for the immigrants and required to base their intellectual political project only on the most successful individuals from all of those who arrived to Lima, Vera's video does not pretend to make the indigenous world more accessible to us, but it reveals how it is related to a larger structure. One of the merits of Vera's work is that all the time it makes explicit, with different levels of detail, the internal conflicts and representation of the Andean worlds, which inevitably have always tergiversated and homogenized it, embodied and have played in the own constitution of the Peruvian contemporary society. In this way, by extracting an astonishing modernity from an archaeological construction of pre-colonial Peru, Vera's basic artistic operation consists in brutally challenging the referential primitive framework with a point of view and language that does not dodge, but clarify elemental situations of the indigenous presence in Lima, and articulates them in terms of a concrete material transcendence, while situating the old indigenous world in a semantic horizon that transmutes without losing it into contemporary setting, experiences, and images. In radical opposition to Goldie and De Gregory, who implicitly suggest that if the Andean immigrants in Lima that interest them were able to succeed, was only because they stopped having an indigenous subjectivity. Vera's piece shows how these interior conflicts remain intact, even when they are framed in a larger problematic of the huge social tensions that flow along every single level of social life in Peru. Or, in Cornejo Polar words, he illuminates the, quote, extreme contradiction that appears when nations trying to express their heteroclite nature and resolve their national problem, or rather indigenous problems, by reflection and fiction only repeated. Thank you.
We invite our discussant, Emma Chibuni, who teaches in the anthropology department here at PhD, and with indigenous movements in Latin America, specifically in Ecuador.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me as discussion group. It's very interesting panel. I'm going to try to simply suggest a few things that I think would suggest a few lines on how to put these two papers together, because they are very different, but they have some connections. And then I will pose some comments and questions to each of the presenters. I think what I saw in these two papers, especially in terms of bringing together, connecting issues of space, art, temporality, in the way they try to either produce or contest or reproduce different themes related to questions of national identity. Some of the connections and the overlapping elements that we can see, especially in the longer versions of the paper that, Chris' paper that I read, there is this very interesting reading of poetry as some kind of guide into this kind of analysis, because in his longer paper he refers to Rocket Dalton and the way in which the poetry of Rocket Dalton factors in the lyrics of some of the bands he mentions. And in Gustavo's paper there is a reference to, obviously, to Vallejo as some kind of visionary ways of dealing with these issues related to these contestations of national identity and the exploration of these tensions that I thought was very interesting. There are also other elements that I think the two papers present, the use and the reference to historical motifs that happen in a totally different environment, in a totally different temporality, and what that transposition of this historical motif in a different moment represent or say or can mean when related again to the contestation of national identity. And what I found also very interesting is this reference to the telluric forces that comes out in both papers, although one is Salvador and the other one is Peru, so there must be something there that I need both of you to figure out what that is. So I thought it was a very, very interesting connections that both what I think the major link between the two that they explore is this constant and historical tension between the rural and the urban, and that is still there, that is not being resolved, and on which there is history of discrimination, power, domination that has capitalized on these tensions and these distinctions. So that without, I'm going to leave that to that for trying to connect the two papers, and I'm going to deal with each of them separately. My comments on Chris' papers are based on the longer version that I read, so I might address something that he has not talked about here. I have a couple, all my comments are going to be suggestions for further exploration on how to integrate all these different elements that you have in your paper, and then you can take whatever makes more sense to you. The first one that I found very important, I think, is to connect your discussion of mestizaje to the very rich and lengthy intellectual tradition of different writers that are more or less contemporary to Castro, that in different parts of Latin America are thinking along those lines and are referring to this ideological construction of mestizaje in reference to the formation of national identity. And obviously, though they point to similarities, but they also refer to the specificity of their own countries, right? And I say this because there are some of the elements that you have highlighted about Castro's ideas and thinking about Salvadoran identity that resonate with some of these other authors. The most obvious is the Mexican Vasconcelos, but I'm not going there. I'm thinking of someone like Benjamin Carrion in Ecuador, or some other authors that were all thinking along those lines of, okay, these are very, how do we make sense of this heterogeneity when we have to produce an idea or an image of one national identity? So how can we all be unified, on this? And there is a very interesting ambiguity, I think, in this discourse, because it happens in a moment in which many Latin American countries and intellectuals are trying to take distance from a tradition of racial theory that had impose a very negative connotation on miscegenation. And so how can you rescue mestizaje from this negativity and then transform it into some positive element that is at the same time positive and distinctive of Latin America, but at the same time this is an operation made by elite intellectuals, and so at the expenses of many other sectors of the populations in this country that were at the same time included and excluded. An all-inclusive ideology of exclusion, I think, was the term, this operation, this impact operation. So I think there you could find ways of connecting the Salvadorian case to this very rich sort of intellectual tradition and figure out how in the case of El Salvador, I don't think you can escape, and it would be very interesting once you get more into the discussion of mestizaje to see how these racialized identities really play in the case of the country you are analyzing there. The other question that I wasn't totally clear why you decided to choose that particular example is about Argentina. Because I see Argentina and the Cono Sur as some very different histories from Central America. And so if you want to compare and contrast, I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, because the question of European immigration is very relevant for those countries, but not for many other countries of the Latin American region, right, where European immigration was very, didn't have the same kind of impact and was not as massive. And again, I keep thinking about Ecuador because of the cases that I know better, but the attempt to widen the population by bringing European immigrants never didn't work at all. So that is the question. So I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. Not all countries have built, like a narrative around something like a gaucho that is the case of Argentina. So I'm not really sure whether or not that comparison is helpful in your case. Okay, so then the question of art form and art, and specifically music, so I understand your point to look at heavy metal as a way of contesting. And as you say at the very end of your paper, as both constructing and deconstructing discourses of national identity. My questions were more in terms of how to make this argument a little stronger on the specificity of this particular art form that you analyze. And why I'm saying this, because I think, especially in the Latin American region, this kind of dissident voice through music, it's not new, and it's being taken over by different genres of music. Urbana, it's one. There's, different rock bands. I'm thinking, well, it has to because it was probably before I couldn't remember the name of that Mexican rock band, and then he told me, Café Tacuba, which again, all these different groups have social critique, political critique, anti-imperialist critique, critique of the United States imperialism, bringing issues of internal inequalities and racism and problems, etc., etc. So that there is a tradition, and I'm thinking that's musically. I'm thinking, what about Latin American theater and performing arts? It's all over the place with these dissident voices that address both politics and internal issues, right? And at the same time, I'm no expert of heavy metal. Quite honestly, I have to admit that I don't really like it too much. But my understanding is that heavy metal by definition is a dissident sort of art form. So what is specifically then that these Salvadorian heavy metal bands are saying, so once you frame in this more large, sort of wider tradition, or wider, I hate to use the word tradition, or wider narratives of dissident voices that in the region, to connect them to this. So it wasn't very clear to me what is that exactly these bands are saying about what for them means to be Salvadorian, other than opposing themselves or contrasting themselves from the producers, and what is that makes them very different from even what Castro says about Salvadoran identity. Because I found, I was going on rereading the quote that you have in your paper that you took from Castro, and this idea of resistance, which is again another common theme throughout the region, it's even in there, expressed in a different way. So I thought it would be very interesting to see how the lyrics of these bands at the same time connect and dialogue with those voices like Castro and others in the language that we might think of, in Salvador. And at the same time deconstruct them, but then how and what else are they saying? So what kind of sense of Salvadorianness they are putting forward, in their lyrics? Because again, I think this sense of, the same ideology of mestizaje has this in itself, this idea of resistance. We have endured all these, and here we are, proud of the racial mixture of, that got all these different great elements of culture, different cultures, and produced who we are. So that there is a certain kind of sense of philosophical almost, or existential narrative of resistance in those more formal voices, voices as well. So it would be probably an interesting thing to do, to connect it to these history. And then the last point probably is to also explain better what is, because you were talking about how for Castro and there is this sense of Salvadoran identity very much tied to the rural space, right, and lifestyle, and it's a kind of almost bucolic sort of rendering of the rural space. So then, what is that these bands are counterposing to that? They're not just because they're based in an urban space. Okay? So how is this tension between the rural and the urban factoring in their imagination, in their lyrics, in their art? Okay, so that was for Gustavo. I read an earlier version of your paper, so some of the things I might say here, you might have addressed it already in the later version, and the first impression when I read your paper was that you are onto something that was to me very intriguing, but I needed more transitions and connections between the different threads that you put in there. It's almost like, using the metaphor of the statue that you used. It was like there were pieces of a statue, but they were not yet put together to have a form. So, for example, one of the things I was not completely clear was how you were thinking of the connection between the debate of Lo Andino and the different ways in which these are, because in the previous version of this, there was the whole discussion about Lo Andino and as tied to the environment, to a specific environment, and then how that became disattached from that specific environment and became something on its own itself produced, right? So I was thinking, okay, if that is how is that connected to? Maybe you have talked a little bit more about this in your second version, but in the first one, I wasn't very clear how that then connected and linked to the urban space, to Lima, and to the discussion of Lo Andino from the urban, from Lima, from the perspective of that space. And also my question is how, in this perception of Lo Andino produced in Peru, what is that connects to perception or discussion of Lo Andino as the Andean region, and not just Peru, like Bolivia and Ecuador, and whatever is Lo Andino conceived at a more sort of broader geographical level in the Latin American region. So what constitutes the Andean region, La Región Andina, or La Cultura Andina, as like a broader category. So what is the impact, if there is anything that participates in the way people in Peru have been writing and thinking about Lo Andino locally that connects with this other dimension. I understand that you are reading the question of the museum, which I found a very interesting element, to think about the museum as a way of disembodying indigeneity and indigenous identity from the actual indigenous people of the present. And and in doing that and representing it as a kind of iconic representation of the pre-colonial past, you are simply killing whatever is left behind, right? And I think this is a common thing that happens happens in Bolivia, it happens in Ecuador as well, right? In different ways, because in these other countries there is no the same discourse of the Incas as some kind of pride of the past. So that is an interesting element that I see, that, and even more interesting because that is happening in a place that before was not identified as an Andean space because it was the city, was the coastal, right? What in this process though did not came clear to me is how you are tossing in the question of neoliberalism. That is also in the title of the paper, but you do not expand on that. Okay, so what is that is making? Is the neoliberal the neoliberal problem, the associated problem symbolized by the decadence of the museum, physical decadence of the museum? And then if that is like a metaphorical reading of that, then I wanted to hear more about how you were thinking about this connection, because that it wasn't very clear to me when I read your paper. And then the same question of museums, right? Because museums in general have always played a very important role in the production of the imagined national community in many parts of the world, just I think in Latin America. And so that is less surprising to me that, that particular museum, would go through a very similar sort of discourse, having that kind of function in participating in that history. And so it would be more interesting to know more about how that museum became such a decadent object in the urban space, right? And how people have related to that museum before and not how they relate to it now. What is the life of this museum from birth to death? Really say more about the problems that you are pointing out. Questions of identity, questions of indigenous silence, and questions of economics and power.
To respond. Well, one of the things is, let's see. Okay, well, with the question on Argentina, the main reason I included Argentina is because that's the point where Baron Castro starts his analysis of the population. Right? He says, we're not like Argentina because we don't have this, this, and this, but there's a similar construction of national identity if we take out the idea of the gaucho, which is completely absent from El Salvador. But the idea of this rural versus urban, civilization versus barbarity is the same sort of discussion that is somewhere underwritten in Castro's work. Another question with his mestizaje is one of the things that is pointed out in the introduction to his book is the fact that Baron Castro is trying to, in a certain sense, rewrite the Leyenda Negra, basically the tradition of the Spanish conquistador being a raper and pillager, and he's trying to sort of rewrite that and say, no, well, they really weren't that bad, right? They brought us this and they brought us that, et cetera, et cetera. So he's sort of going against that tradition and trying to use this history of the population of El Salvador to do it. In the introduction, another writer that has an introduction in his book goes into detail about that and explains how the Spanish conquistador in El Salvador would marry off into weddings, and the women were offered and willing to go, et cetera, et cetera. Sort of trying to rewrite this within the identity of the Salvadoran. And I think that's one point where these bands sort of try to open the dialogue by using the PLAS. They try to bring up the idea of the indigenous again as repressed, where there's sort of this idea where in El Salvador that's sort of been forgotten, which is why I go into the idea of the massacre of 1932 being brought up, because Baron Castro completely ignores the fact that there was a massacre in 1932 of indigenous and rural workers. Completely ignores it. It could be that he wasn't aware of it because he was in Spain at the time when he was writing, but in his 1970s introduction to the book, he completely ignores it again. So, to me, it sort of, that just the fact that 1932 happens as he's writing this idea of mestizaje sort of works against his idea of what mestizaje is really happening in El Salvador, because if we're all just sort of coming together and accumulating under this idea of mestizo, then why are we killing off indigenous people?
Yeah, but this is it's the same narrative all over.
Yeah, it's the same narrative. I'm not saying that it's not, but in El Salvador, that's the one specific event. I mean, in Peru, we could go back to Tupac Amaru or similar events and different stories, but the thing that Salvadoran metal does within itself is try to make it as local as possible. They're taking an idea that's, black metal and stuff like that starts in Norway, starts in Finland, and they're trying to use it in a local sense to pose the same question. For example, black metal in Norway, the one reason people were writing black metal in Norway was to speak out against the the Christianization of their country. They try to go back to their Nordic past and say, no, we were Vikings first, Thor, and et cetera, and we don't want Christians here, and it ended up in actual violence, church burnings and sacrifices, and et cetera, to go back to this pre-Christian past. And I think that idea is easy to take into concept in El Salvador and make it local because they have the same forced Christianity upon their past. So they try to do the same thing but make it local. And I think that's the main thing that I'm trying to get at in the Salvadoran lyrics is not just like, oh, well, let's just play metal, let's be resistant, but let's make it local. Let's make it about what happened here in El Salvador. Let's specifically talk about El Salvador and deconstruct the idea that's been given to us since we were kids, that the Salvadoran this, the Salvadoran is that. We're all agriculture workers, we all speak with this type of accent, we all eat this type of food. The other thing with this idea of mestizaje is they try to completely ignore the European influence, which I think a lot of in the urban spaces they try to hold on to. You know, we're a little bit more European than you think we are. It's an attitude that I got from a lot of the band members. Like, no, we're much more like everybody else. We're not Salvadoran like those people out in the field. So, we're the dissenting voice, and I think theater ties in greatly with it, as you mentioned. I mean, there's definitely use of iconography. Being on stage, there's a lot of theatricality to it. When I was at the Metal Fest, they had a guy come out in full Mayan garb and juggling fire and really, really dangerous stuff because he just jumps in the middle of the crowd and he's swinging these fireballs around. But I think theatricality would definitely, it would be interesting to tie the two together, definitely, especially with music. And then the bucolic voice, I mean, the urban spaces, that I feel that what they're trying to show is that when they do use urban spaces, they use them as post-apocalyptic, or they use them as war zones. And I think that that's sort of what San Salvador has felt like for many of the metal bands since the Civil War. And in the Civil War, they would stop metalheads and just cut their hair off, because if you had long hair and you listened to metal, you were a leftist, period. You know, they would shave your face, they'd cut your hair, and they'd send you back out. Good luck. You're no longer leftist. So to them, I think that a lot of this has to do with the post-Civil War. There's a lot of disagreement with the peace treaty that happened and what that means for the Salvadoran, especially because the government holds up this big line, like, look how great everything's become since the peace treaties. But these people that live in the urban spaces are still suffering violence in their new form, which is La Mater, which a lot of these bands compare this gang violence to a new type of war. So for them, their landscape has not changed. It's still a war zone. It's just a different type of war zone. Instead of having these big guerrilla groups grouped together into a political, we have these little tiny groups of people controlling territories and controlling your life. So there's a lot of that in the lyrics, and I think a lot of that is what influences this use of urban spaces, especially as post-apocalyptic or as war zones, which of course I didn't get into too much into my paper.
Thank you for your comments, Emma. Yeah, I mean, as I said at the beginning, this is a very preliminary text, and sorry for presenting a big conversion from what I sent you before, but I think you are right about the connections, that I think to think more about them. That's something that I want to say something about this, how this idea of the Andes, something I also, it's not something that I am comfortable with. It's something that I've been actually writing one of my comprehensive exams on how this region is a problem more than a real region. And there's, as I said, some part of the paper that are just it's a set of overlapping layers, and that you can go back to the Humboldt or even before and So they can reconcile the different ideas what's the Andes and why the Andes found this region, and they're not indigenous people in the coast of Peru or in the cities, and this is an old discussion. But I think what I am interested here is more, I guess what I'm trying to do here in some part is studying have a Peruvian anthropologist as my object of study somehow. So not exactly the region, but how they're dealing with this area, and how this idea of it's been somehow present, but all the time. From progressively, it's been kind of melted in any reference that. You don't need a real space, just like a virtual space, basically, on the Andes for. But I guess that the hardest part is think about this connection from neoliberalism and the museum. I guess my basic, probably naive connection in the paper was, it was, like you said, decadence of the museums. For me, there's something in this video that, because it's I don't mention this in the paper, but it's located in an area that used to be like a very, elegant street, and now it's, completely abandoned. And also this project, and I guess what I like it and I think it's interesting, what the video is doing is that this museum was supposed to kill the objects, but then the museum dies itself in a larger thing. So I think this idea of how not just saying, okay, there's this object that dies, there's this person that's accessing the market, and now we need to understand how this person has changed, this sort of life has changed. I like this idea of, and I guess that's somehow very come from my, basic understanding of ideas, that there's always these larger problems that, but there are also these, so it's not about just like the, there are different layers of levels of conflict, and I think like what has been done in the recent years is just suppress like these deep or intimate layers that are also in conflict, or they're looking at the larger picture of how well are they doing in the economy, how much money in the bank's account, how much money, but not. And I think it's interesting for me because that's the dominant approach in Peruvian anthropology, not. And there's no institutional, I guess any institution move to change that in terms of, questioning these protocols of research or forms of ethnography that are being done. So I guess I'm just mentioning all these because I think for me that's also somehow it's a form of how neoliberalism is present for me also in academia there. So this idea of that then, okay, this is the museum that you were questioning indigenistas, okay, and we know that this is, it was a crazy project, but then, sadly, this museum is also dying. That museum, there was a project of this, whatever Lima, like the glory years of Lima, it's also like so. And then there's all these indigenous writers that already anticipated that somehow. So it's, I don't know, I like this, this move, I guess, but I need to be, I know for sure that I need to be more clear about this, but I guess what I was trying to suggest here was more about a paper about method and how we can challenge, forms of ethnography or ethnographic language, or more than just, saying, okay, this is what I'm seeing here, but just like a way of a critique of, or opening other possibilities to think of a different type of an employee to study. People, Lima's people in Lima.
Right. I think we have some time to open the floor to some questions as well.
Sure. I mean, the question for Chris is a side topic maybe, but just wondering about how you, I mean, and you made the comparison with Brazil and how metal kind of emerges as this political idiom, and I mean, that resonates a lot too with things I have like from Colombia as well, like growing up and identifying the voice of metal as something qualitatively different than other kind of genres. And there has been more written perhaps on hip hop, rap, and the way that has circulated. Again, often very clearly as a language of political contestation. So I mean, I was just curious to know your thoughts on that, and what is it I can intuitively kind of identify something qualitatively different about metal and the way it emerges in these contexts, but I don't know exactly what it is, so I was just curious to.
Well, I would say that the one big difference between metal and other genres of music, like rock and hip hop, is that rock and hip hop are more easily bought into pop culture. You can go to a bar in El Salvador, you can hear Red Hot Chili Peppers, you can hear rock bands, and nobody's shocked by it. You can hear Snoop Dogg and people are dancing, et cetera, but turn on Rami and all of a sudden the whole room is, what's going on? You know, it's dissonant not only in its message, but in its sound, in the way it's done, screaming instead of singing, et cetera, et cetera. It's supposed to, I feel that it's supposed to shock you out of your normal routine. And I've done the experiment. I've gone to regular Latin American bars where they're playing salsas and rancheras, and gone to the jukebox and I put on heavy metal to see everyone's reaction, and it's shocking. People are immediately, you know, it brings you out of what's going on and you go, wow.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the comparison, especially with hip hop, is particularly interesting, just as an urban kind of an urban idiom of contestation and what it's kind of representing. And
I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, there was even some metal and hip hop crossovers because they have a very similar anti-political, sort of social idea, and I think it really depends on, I mean, there's certain types of hip hop that are definitely more acceptable, but I think hip hop in itself, especially in its roots, is very similar to what metal wants to do. Yeah, I think it's a great comparison, and I've considered it as well in the thesis that I'm working on, definitely.
Do you think that metal's like utility as kind of a dissident art form is in any way limited by the fact that it doesn't necessarily have as broad-based of an appeal as those other genres? And I mean, is this something that people are interested in kind of working around, or is this something you picked up on at all? That's one thing that I was wondering about here.
No, I've definitely picked up on it. The big problem in El Salvador is there's really no industry for metal. There's a large metal community, but you're not making money. You're not going to live off of it. You have to sacrifice to do it. And basically, it sounds cheesy, but for the love of the genre, I mean, it's frowned upon in a majority of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you literally have to go to specific places, specific events. I mean, and most of the people that, even Metal Fest and all the concerts that they bring big bands, they generally lose money every time.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not I wouldn't say that it's anything close to rock or anything, but the fact that it's able to sustain itself for over 20 years, and it started in the midst of a civil war, when it was it was very dangerous to be a metalhead. And it takes a certain amount of dedication, especially, I mean, to wear black all the time in a country that's so hot. I was at the Metal Fest, and there's people in leather, like complete leather head to toe. I said, okay. I couldn't do it. Does anyone have a red shirt or anything? Yeah, it takes a certain, and they're very conscious of it too. There's a large debate going on between them. Like, what can we do to make metal an industry in our country, not just to make money, but for us to live off of. But the resistance is to, let's not make it too much like rock. You know, we don't want it to be popular. We want it to do what it does, but we want a larger fan base. So it's a huge debate that's going on within the community.
I have a question for Gustavo. I also explored Lo Andino and the problem of it. And I guess the paradox that I put forth to you is, can we talk about Lo Andino without talking about Lo Andino? Can we talk about it in different terms? And I really enjoyed, your examples from Arguedas, and different ways of seeing the Andean. And I was wondering, and I felt like you needed something to contrast the museum as this antiquated form of putting the Andean museum in this pre-Columbian form. And I was wondering if you had seen La Teta Asustada, the Milk of Sorrow. And I don't know if you have thought about the presence of the indigenous migrant community in that film against the backdrop of Lima and in this urban environment. And if you feel that it either perpetuates Lo Andino or is it a departure from Lo Andino. So that's something to consider. But in the modern Andean subject, reformulation of identity, and so forth.
I think that's a great question. Because this thing about the markets, I think that's how the discussion can be basically. That's a core of the discussion of this thing of what the if the articulation to the market transform what was what's the power or that the market or people articulated to the market coming from communities. What's the market doing to these people? So I guess there's this one group of anthropologists that believe that has revolutionary power and transforms one's subjectivity radically, no matter, and basically leaves nothing. And this other extreme that it says, okay, nothing happens, right? It's just like the same. If there's something like a criminal logic exists somewhere, it's still there. But I think I'm not saying that. What I'm trying to do with here, I think, and I'm more concerned about is just to don't go to these radical positions and just trying to think about different ways, because I think the debate right now is like, is there something or there's nothing? Is this just like someone who can be selling at a corner store, or is this someone who, we need to go and read ethnohistory to understand it. So I think that's, I think and there are more, I think anthropology has this, this is precisely for me that has enough tools to deal with these complex subjectivities. And I'm not saying just, there's violence, there's a history of marginalization, there's a history of racism, there's a history. And that suddenly disappears when somebody gets access to the market. So I'm just like, that's kind of why I'm just not easily convinced by this approach. But there's also, I think, at least with, I'm not a person who has done too much research in cities, actually. I've done research in communities in Cusco. And I think there, and I think that's why I like also Cornejo Polar so much, because I think he deals very well with this problem of what it's, of these unstable identities, so that it's not, black or white, but there's something that, but it's not also like this happy mix, but there's tension, and there's problems there. There's something that it's interesting, at least from a political perspective, to see. But I think that these frameworks, these ways of doing our it's not. So yeah, I mean, for me, I think also people, change, decide to do things, and that I don't think that that's something that it's bad at all. But I'm just saying that when just highlighting that how people success in the city, I think we are again once more putting hiding some of the old problems that are in the core of the constitution of the previous society. Like it's this thing of how we hide what's so I guess that's my answer to your question, because I think I'm also thinking about, Latino is so charged with different connotations, especially for anthropologists. Nowadays it's basically saying that you are someone who wants to restore the Inca Empire, But I think there's more than that again. There's other, especially reading from other discussions in anthropology happening in different regions. The Amazon. I'm just trying to say that I think it's very important to start thinking about new ways of doing ethnography. That it's not just about looking how successful are these people after several number of generations in the city. It's kind of like.
All right, I think we can continue the conversation during the break. What remains is to thank our panelists and discussant.
And there'll be coffee and cookies outside for those who need a little bit of afternoon shaking up. Yeah, of course.
But it happens a lot. The one I teach in
Oh, really?
there's a projector that just had it works with one student.
Right.